On that cold February night, Henry Miles had already lost count of how many layers of cold he had endured since life had unraveled. 46 years old, an ex-structural engineer, for years the kind of man who knew exactly where every bolt was supposed to be. Now he hardly knew where to place his feet the next day. His house had been taken over by debts like a castle, slowly sinking into a swamp, silently. His wife, Melissa, had been gone for almost a year, consumed by a cancer as swift as it was cruel. And the final blow came when Noah, his 8-year-old son, was taken away by social services authorities who deemed it inadequate to raise a child in the back of an old truck parked behind an industrial warehouse in Queens. Since then, Henry had been living in a limbo of grey days and cutting nights, fueled by expired snacks and the stubborn hope that he could still fulfill the whispered promise in his son's ear. "It's just for now. I'll come back to get you." That very night, Henry had tried to deliver 2 more resumes, one at a workshop, the other at a parts store. Both had rejected him with the same pitying look and the canned excuse, "We're fully staffed at the moment, but good luck." He returned to his tired, dirty pickup truck with a heart heavier than the lug nuts clinging to his pants. He parked in his usual spot behind the warehouse where trucks came to unload chemicals during the day, and silence reigned absolute at night. Before curling up between the steering wheel and the tilted seat back, he decided to walk over to a nearby covered walkway where he knew the public internet signal sometimes worked. He wanted to check if any company had responded to his application emails. When he arrived, he realized he wasn't alone. A well-dressed woman, trembling from the cold and without a coat, huddled against the concrete wall, trying in vain to warm her hands with her breath. Henry wasn't the type of man who approached strangers, much less women who were visibly well-dressed, who surely were in a hurry and preferred distance. But there was something about that scene that went beyond any social code. The woman trembled as if trying to hide that she was freezing, maintaining an upright, almost arrogant posture, yet her eyes betrayed exhaustion. He recognized that look. It was the same he had seen in the mirror when Noah was taken, not out of despair, but pure helplessness. Without a second thought, he took off the only coat he had, a worn-out model, stained on the sleeves and with a stuck zipper, and extended it to her naturally. "You're going to get sick like this," he said softly, as if commenting on the weather forecast. The woman looked at him with a mixture of surprise, confusion, and disbelief. For a second, she thought about refusing, perhaps out of pride, perhaps by instinct, but she accepted. With trembling hands, she put on the coat that was too big for her slender frame and, for an instant, seemed to nestle inside a distant memory. Claire Langston was not someone easily unsettled. CEO of Infinity Group, she lived by a schedule programmed to the second, shielded by assistants, drivers, and carefully arranged commitments. But that night had escaped her logic. She had lost her cell phone in the taxi, the driver had dropped her off at the wrong stop, and, without a coat, she faced winter with a silent fury. She was about to ask for help, perhaps even step into some random bar, when that man, dirty, disheveled, smelling of oil and disinfectant, offered her the one thing that still protected him. She had never believed in coincidences, but that gesture triggered something that no therapist had been able to reach in years of sessions. Claire found herself transported back to when she was 7, huddled at a bus stop in Newark after fleeing the orphanage where she was abused. A man, also a stranger, had offered her his own coat on that icy morning. It was the first time she felt that she mattered to someone. And now, decades later, the cycle was repeating itself, with her on the receiving end of the gesture. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that that scene couldn't end there. Henry did not expect gratitude. In fact, he expected nothing. After so long being ignored, he had learned to do good in silence, as if tossing a bottle into the sea without knowing if anyone would ever find it. When he saw that the woman accepted the coat, he simply nodded and took a step back, leaning against the wall again, as if his presence should vanish along with the gesture. The silence between them lasted for long minutes, broken only by the sound of the wind whirring in the corners and the distant announcement of a bus that never arrived. Claire pulled the coat up to her chin, as if she wanted to hide inside it. Henry put his hands in his pockets and tried to ignore the tingling in his fingers, already numb from the cold. But he couldn't help glancing sideways at her, trying to decipher what made someone so clearly out of place be there alone, vulnerable, in the middle of the night. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than he expected. "Do you always do this? Give the little you have to someone you don't know?" He didn't answer immediately. He thought, took a deep breath, then uttered the phrase simply, "I only do what I would like to have done for me. Today, it was you. Tomorrow, it could be my son." Those words hung in the air like a dense fog. Claire didn't reply, but something within her gave way. For a few seconds, she was no longer the executive of a multinational, nor the woman who dominated meeting rooms with sharp remarks. She was just someone freezing from the cold, grateful for a gesture that had no price. The bus finally appeared, and she boarded without looking back. Henry, for his part, returned to the truck with a trembling body and a light soul. He didn't know that that night was far from over. He couldn't have imagined that his name, erased from so many records, would soon be urgently sought, not by anyone, but by the woman he had just embraced. Claire spent a sleepless night. Even in her penthouse with central heating, expensive sheets, and automated curtains, she couldn't disconnect from what had happened under that marquee. It wasn't just the gesture itself, it was the feeling of being touched by something that transcended protocol, logic, and status. In the morning, she arrived at the Infinity Group headquarters earlier than usual. The team barely had time to react to her unscheduled arrival. She left her new cell phone on the table and looked at Michael, her direct assistant, with a gaze mixing urgency and confusion. "I need you to find someone. I don't know his name, but I will tell you what he looks like and where he was yesterday." Michael, used to corporate challenges, choked internally at the strangeness of the mission, but silently nodded. Claire then described the man in the coat in detail. The marks on his face, the tired look, the smell of gasoline, the way he talked about his son. "He doesn't have social media, no LinkedIn, but he exists, and I need to find him." What started as an almost symbolic search soon turned into an obsession. The company's talent tracking team, accustomed to finding technology geniuses hidden in the depths of Poland or India, found themselves tasked with a much more difficult mission: to find a man invisible to the system. Days were spent sifting through security cameras, cross-referencing images with public records, accessing shelter databases and social services reports. Michael, initially skeptical, began to take the challenge as a personal mission. Something about that man awakened empathy even in the most pragmatic. After almost a week of searching, they managed to trace a pattern. Every night around 10 p.m., the same white, rusty truck parked behind a warehouse in the industrial zone. And beside it, invariably, a solitary man would get off, stretch his legs, look at the sky as if uttering a silent prayer, and then disappear inside the cab. When Claire received confirmation, she felt a lump in her throat. Finally, the reunion was no longer a desire. It was a choice, and she already knew what she needed to do. The next night, Claire skipped the company car and went in person to the warehouse. It was cold, but this time she was prepared. Thick coat, lined boots, tightly wrapped scarf. She arrived before 10, parked discreetly across the street, and waited. She wasn't exactly sure what she would say, nor how he would react. She was afraid of seeming intrusive, patronizing, or worse, someone trying to buy redemption with a good deed. But she also knew she couldn't ignore it. When the old truck appeared at the end of the street, its headlights half dim and its body vibrating with a tired engine, Claire held her breath. Henry got off slowly, as if carrying too much weight on his shoulders. He walked to the corner where he always stretched, looked at the cloudy sky, and began to withdraw. It was then that he heard footsteps approaching on the sidewalk. "Hi," she said, with a choked voice and her hands hidden in her pockets. Henry recognized her immediately but hesitated. He hadn't expected to see her again, much less here. "Did you come to return the coat?" he joked in a light tone, trying to hide his surprise. Claire smiled awkwardly and shook her head. "No, I came to return something else. Or rather, to offer you something." He frowned, confused, and looked around as if checking whether it was a prank. Claire took a deep breath, then launched into her explanation, as if time were insufficient to explain everything. She recounted her childhood, the bus stop man, the impact of that gesture, her relentless search for him. And she explained that after the previous night, something inside her broke or reconnected. "You reminded me of who I was before I built my walls, and now I want to do something for you, but not as charity. It's a proposal." Henry, who wasn't used to being caught off guard, simply stared at her in silence. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. Claire explained that she had created a new position at Infinity Group, Human Values Advisor, a title that might seem strange at first glance, but which, to her, made perfect sense. You won't need to talk about technology, lead teams, or deal with spreadsheets. You'll just be there, listen, talk with people, remind them what it means to be human. That's what we need. Henry let out a dry laugh, not of mockery, but of disbelief. "You want to put a homeless man inside a multinational to teach humanity?" Claire did not back down. She looked him in the eyes and replied firmly, "I want someone who knows what it's like to lose everything and still offer what he has. That's worth more than any MBA." Henry fell silent, processing every word. He wasn't used to being considered useful, especially by someone like her. The proposal was surreal, almost absurd, but there was such raw sincerity in the way Claire spoke that he couldn't refuse immediately. In the following days, Henry slept little and thought too much. He spent hours staring at the ceiling of the truck cab, trying to understand whether it was a scam, a prank, or a real chance. There was fear, a lot of fear. Fear of failing, of being rejected, of being a fish out of water in an aquarium of suit and tie. But there was also something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of possibility. Claire did not appear again in the following days. She respected his time, but she left a card and a direct message. "If you decide to give it a try, call me. You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing." Henry held that card as if it were a ticket to a place where he no longer knew if he deserved to be. On the morning of the fourth day, after a confusing dream with Noah and Melissa smiling in the back seat of the truck, he showered at a community center, got his hair cut with an old razor, and called Claire. Her voice on the other end of the line sounded like a new beginning. Henry's first day at Infinity Group was anything but comfortable. The borrowed suit pinched, the mirrored elevator seemed to judge his presence with every reflection, and the looks from the employees ranged between curiosity and bewilderment. But Claire made sure to greet him personally, walking beside him through the lobby as if he were a veteran returning home. She introduced him not as a social project, but as someone with an important mission for the company's culture. "He's going to help us remember what we forgot along the way, to listen, to welcome, to observe." Henry's office was small, next to the HR department. Nothing luxurious, but quiet, bright, with a comfortable armchair and a window overlooking an inner garden. On the first day, hardly anyone showed up. He spent the morning reading papers he didn't quite understand, drinking watered-down coffee, and wondering what on earth he was doing there. But on the second day, a marketing analyst knocked on the door. She said she just wanted to talk. She was exhausted, anxious, insecure, and couldn't stand the pressure of unreachable targets any longer. Henry didn't say much. He simply listened. He asked simple questions. He shared that he too had days when getting out of bed was a battle. The woman cried, laughed, and left visibly lighter. After her, others came. A manager who had lost his father, an intern who couldn't feel part of the team, a programmer afraid of being fired. They all sat in Henry's blue armchair and, little by little, left some of their anxieties there. And without realizing it, what was meant to be a symbolic position turned into a real listening space. The so-called Henry's room became a reference point for anyone who needed to breathe. He didn't offer miraculous solutions, nor ready-made phrases, just his presence. And in a world where everyone seemed too busy, that was revolutionary. If this part moved you, leave your like on the video. It really helps the channel reach more people with stories that truly matter. As the weeks passed, Henry began arriving before schedule and leaving after everyone else. Not out of obligation, but because that environment started giving back to him something he had thought lost, the feeling of belonging. He learned the name of every receptionist, discovered who drank coffee without sugar, and who was afraid of public speaking. He walked through the corridors like someone crossing an old neighborhood, offering a nod here, a caring question there. Some employees began leaving anonymous notes under his office door, asking for advice, thanking him for conversations, or just venting. It was strange and at the same time familiar, as if he were becoming who he was before the world had collapsed. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about Noah. His room, still in the temporary shelter, was white and colorless. Henry visited him whenever he could, but he still didn't have permission to bring him back, and that gnawed at him inside. Claire watched everything from a distance. She avoided invading the space she had offered, but kept a close eye on the effects of that silent presence. Gradually, she saw internal climate reports improving, noticed less turnover, and observed meetings becoming lighter. But what impressed her most was the subtle impact, the conversations at the coffee area, the laughter in corridors that had always been silent. She began to understand that Henry wasn't there to teach empathy, but to evoke long-forgotten memories. A living reminder that everyone carries their battles and that sometimes all someone needs is to be heard. One Friday morning, Claire went down to his office unannounced. She carried a folder with documents and an expression mixing seriousness and hope. "I got what you wanted," she said before even sitting down. It was the documentation for Henry to file for permanent custody of Noah. He read the papers slowly, as if rereading a long-awaited letter. When he looked up, there were held-back tears, and something Claire had not seen in him until then: genuine gratitude, without guilt. That same afternoon, Henry left Infinity Group early. He didn't tell anyone. He took a bus to the shelter where Noah lived, and for the first time in a long while, felt that maybe that promise made in the back of the truck was about to be fulfilled. The boy ran to see him, as he always did, but there was something different in their embrace. Henry seemed less tired, more present. They talked for hours in the small visiting room, played Battleship on an old board, and then, while Noah ate cookies, Henry talked about the possibility of living together again. "Really, Dad? Really? Will there be a bed and a fridge?" The simplicity of the questions tore him apart inside. He nodded, trying to contain his emotion. On the way back, walking through the cold streets, Henry noticed a rental sign on a small two-bedroom house with a yellowed porch and rusted railings. He jotted down the phone number. For the first time, not as someone who dreams, but as someone beginning to build. With Claire's discreet help, he managed to rent the house and, in the following weeks, furnished everything slowly. Nothing luxurious. A used sofa, a small refrigerator, a bed with a new mattress, and sheets with dinosaur prints. Noah's personal choice. On the day he brought his son to live, with him, Henry hardly slept. He woke up before the sun rose, made crooked pancakes with a taste of victory, and left the old coat folded in the closet, as if preserving a relic. Life began to fall back into place, piece by piece. It wasn't perfect. There were still bills, insecurities, scars. But now there was routine, evening laughter, homework spread out on the kitchen table, and bedtime stories. At night, Henry would sit on the porch and stay silent, watching Noah play on the living room rug. The world was still harsh, but now there was a corner where he could breathe, and in that corner, everything made sense. At Infinity Group, the impact of Henry's presence kept growing. Some directors began visiting his office more often than they sought their own consultants. Projects once stalled by internal disputes flowed with more empathy. During a lunch with one of the departments, an analyst commented that, since Henry arrived, it was as if the company had remembered it was made of people, not just deliveries. That remark went viral in the corridors. Claire, always watching from afar, began to wonder what more she could do with that transformative force. It was then that she proposed something new to the board, an annual event called Day of Kindness, where there would be no targets, spreadsheets, or meetings, only life stories, human connections, and genuine sharing among employees. The proposal generated strangeness, resistance, even jokes, but she persisted. And, two, support the idea. She told the story of the coat. At the official presentation of the event, Claire took the stage holding the battered coat. She recounted in a firm voice the story of that cold night when that coat had been offered to her. She spoke of the gesture, of the childhood memory, of the search, and of the reunion. She pointed to Henry, sitting in the front row beside Noah, who wore a child's badge specially made by the design team for him. At the end of her speech, the coat was placed inside a frame with a light wooden plaque reading, "A small act of kindness can rewrite a life." There was silence in the room, a thick silence, full of meaning. Then came the applause, long, emotional, sincere. Henry lowered his head, not knowing where to hide his face, while his son tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "It's all because of you, Dad, all of this." And in that moment, he was certain, more than in any other phase of his life, that he had become whole again. Gradually, Henry became more than just a reference within the company. He became a symbol. His office came to be informally called Refuge 302, and it was common to see colorful post-its stuck on the door with notes like, "Thank you for yesterday," or "Today was lighter because of you." He never asked for it, nor did he ever fully get used to the compliments. But he learned to accept that his presence there made a difference. Noah also found his place. He spent a few days a week at the company headquarters where he helped organize papers, fed the little fish in a tank in the cafeteria, and loved drawing while his father worked. The employees, once distant, now knew the boy's name and treated him with affection. At home, Henry established a routine he hadn't experienced in a long time. Shared meals, soft background music, the porch light on until late, and bedtime stories told by the bed. Claire and Henry, without realizing it, began to draw closer in a different way. At first, it was only mutual admiration. Then came longer conversations, lunches without agendas, exchanges of confidences outside the corporate environment. She talked about old traumas that had made her controlling, about the fear of trusting, the constant feeling of being measured by achievements. He spoke of the cold early mornings in the truck, of the loneliness after Melissa's death, of the guilt he still carried for not having been able to keep Noah with him from the start. There were no promises, no rush. It was just presence. And in that space, a new relationship was being built, not like an all-consuming soap opera passion, but like a bond built brick by brick. When Claire first showed up at his house with a pie made by her own assistant, Henry opened the door, smiling. "Welcome to our organized chaos," he said, pointing to a rug full of toys and a stove with rice almost burning. She laughed, and she stayed. Take a moment from this story and comment down below. What is the simplest but most powerful gesture someone has ever done for you? Over time, the three began to form their own routine, without anyone labeling it as a family, but it was exactly what it was becoming. Claire appeared on weekends, brought books for Noah, helped Henry cook, and sometimes just sat silently on the sofa with a cup of tea in hand. He got used to her presence without needing to impress, and she learned to slow down around him without needing to control. The time they spent together was light, simple, real. One day, while washing the dishes after dinner, Henry took a small package out of a cabinet that had been stored away for weeks. "Remember the coat?" he asked. Claire nodded. He opened the small box in front of her. Inside was a simple silver ring with a small, unassuming stone. "It was in his pocket since the day you found me. I kept it because deep down, I knew that if life gave me a chance to start over, I wanted to do it with you by my side." Claire was silent for a few seconds. She looked at the ring, then at him, then at Noah, who, from the living room, was singing an invented song while stacking blocks. There was no speech, no movie-like tears, just a long, tight embrace, as if both were saying yes without needing words. After that day, nothing changed drastically, and that was the best part. They continued being the same, only now they knew they were together, even when schedules didn't match, even when life pulled them in different directions. At Infinity Group, Day of Kindness became a tradition. People began volunteering, sharing life experiences, opening up spaces for listening, and there in that company used to charts and targets, stories blossomed. Some small, others transformative, all real. Henry continued in Office 302. Noah grew up surrounded by affection, and Claire gradually learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but perhaps the truest form of strength. Noah, now older and more confident, began to slowly understand everything his father had been through. Some questions arose in the silence. "We were poor, right, Dad? Or did you really sleep in that truck?" Henry always answered honestly, without sugarcoating reality. He said yes, that it was hard, that he was scared, that he cried secretly many times, but that he never stopped believing that one day he would come back to get him. And that, for Noah, was enough. Their nights now were marked by movies on the sofa, pillows thrown on the floor, and difficult questions mixed with popcorn and juice. Henry knew it would still take time for the scars of the past to stop hurting, but he also knew that healing started there, in everyday affection, in frank conversations, and in bonds rebuilt with patience. At work, Henry began to be consulted on decisions that went beyond his role, not out of obligation, but out of respect. When there were conflicts between teams, they called for Henry. When someone needed a more human second opinion, they called for Henry. When the company began to consider expanding the Day of Kindness model to other units outside New York, it was Henry who helped design how that could be done without losing its meaning. He had no spreadsheets or performance indicators, but he had listening, tact, and a rare view of the world. One day, at the end of a meeting, one of the directors, a solemn man with few smiles, called him aside and said, "You've done more for this company in months than we've done in years trying to get things right with. In formulas, thank you." Henry only nodded and gave a slight smile, but he kept that phrase as if it were a diploma. After all, after so long being seen as surplus, he was finally recognized as essential. On an autumn afternoon, Henry arrived home earlier and found Noah on the porch, drawing with colored pencils and a sheet taped to the floor. "This is our family," explained the boy, pointing to the crooked figures. "Him, Henry, and Claire. And this here is the coat," he said excitedly, pointing to a brown square drawn among the three. Henry slowly bent down, observing the details of the drawing, and realized how something so simple had endured so much. Abandonment, cold, loneliness, reunion, love. It wasn't just a coat. It was a link, a landmark, a symbol that even when everything seems lost, a gesture can be the bridge back. He kept the drawing as if it were a relic, and that night allowed Noah to sleep in the same bed as the two of them, simply because he asked. The three stayed, there together, wrapped in the same blanket, as if the whole world could fit in that room. At Infinity Group, Refuge 302 gained an almost institutional status. Henry's office began to inspire other units to create similar spaces. Partner companies wanted to understand the secret. Consultants tried to translate into numbers what he did, but no one could fully replicate it, because what Henry offered was not a formula. It was presence. It was a life well lived. It was the kind of listening that only comes from someone who has been through every layer of pain and still chooses to look at others with compassion. Claire knew that. And when she proposed to the board that Henry become the ambassador of the company's new human culture front, no one objected. He hesitated at first, not because of the title, but out of fear of losing his essence. It was Claire who reassured him, "You don't need to change anything. You just need to keep being you. That's what makes the difference." And he believed her. For the first time, he truly believed. Soon after, a team of documentarians was authorized to film the routine at Infinity Group for a special on new leadership practices. When they arrived at Refuge 302, they expected to find something unusual, perhaps innovative methods or different strategies. But they encountered a simple environment, a bright room, 2 armchairs, a bookshelf with books of real stories, and a jar of candies in the corner of the table, and Henry sitting there, listening to someone with full attention, without interrupting, without a cell phone in his hand, without looking at the clock. The crew filmed, remained silent for a while, and one of the cameramen commented, "We need more of this in the world." That excerpt became a highlight in the documentary, and Henry's figure began circulating as a silent reference to what it means to lead with humanity. He watched the episode at home with Noah and Claire by his side. They laughed at how serious he looked on camera, and Henry awkwardly remarked, "I'm better in person." Noah, with his mouth full of popcorn, added, "You're better with us." One morning, Henry arrived at work and found an envelope on his desk. Inside was the deed to the house where he lived with Noah. There was no card or note, but he knew who had done it. Claire never needed grand gestures, but this was more than a gift. It was a symbolic closure of a cycle. Henry looked out the window, took a deep breath, and stayed there for a few minutes. When he returned home that night, he entered with the envelope in his hands and the coat folded under his arm. Claire was in the kitchen, helping Noah with a school project. Henry approached, handed the coat to her, and with a calm smile said, "Keep it for me. It's your turn to protect someone with it now." Claire held the fabric, looked at him, and did not reply immediately. But her eyes said it all. It was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Together, finally. Life moved on in its new cadence. Henry now split his days between meetings with company leaders, listening sessions with employees, and afternoons doing school tasks with Noah. Simplicity remained his guiding star. He continued taking the subway, wearing the same old analog watch and having lunches with Claire in discreet diners, far from any ostentation. Their home was always full of sounds, pots clanging, footsteps running, muffled laughter, and sometimes comfortable silences. Henry was no longer afraid of losing everything, not because he felt invincible, but because he learned that rebuilding doesn't mean returning to what was. It means creating something new, based on what remains of what is true. Noah grew up with his feet on the ground and eyes attentive, as if he learned early to value the details. And Claire, despite her commitments, seemed lighter. The corporate armor still existed, but now she knew she could take it off when she got home. On the 5th day of kindness, Infinity Group organized an event larger than all the previous ones. They invited longtime employees, family members, partners, and even NGOs supported by the company. There were moving testimonials, listening panels, simple presentations, and a space dedicated to stories of transformation. In the center of the main lobby, a new object had been added to the permanent exhibition, a replica of Refuge 302, with audio recordings of anonymous conversations authorized by former employees. The most visited, however, remained the original coat, framed with its light wooden plaque. People stopped in front of it in silence. Some took photos, others just closed their eyes for a moment. Henry passed by it every year, discreetly, touching the glass for a second before moving on. For him, it wasn't about the coat, it was about everything it represented. the choice to continue being good, even when the world wasn't. On an ordinary night, one with no special event, Henry was sitting on the porch with a blanket over his legs and a cup of tea in his hands. Noah was already asleep, and Claire read beside him, barefoot, with her cold feet touching his, a ritual they had adopted without ever planning it. They didn't speak much, but that wasn't necessary. The presence was enough. Henry looked at the sky and thought of Melissa, not with pain, but with quiet longing. He thought of everything they had lived through, how she would have loved to meet Claire, and how she would have fallen in love with Noah just the way he was now, smiling, curious, secure. Then he remembered the truck, the days of hunger disguised as fasting, the cold that seemed like punishment. And then, as if revisiting an old movie, he thought of that phrase he whispered to his young son when he was taken away. "It's just for now. I'll come back to get you." He did. It took time, but he did. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Here you'll always find real, human stories that truly touch the heart, just like this one. Later, when he got up from his chair, he saw that Claire had left an envelope on the small table on the porch. Inside, there was a magazine clipping featuring an article about him, a handwritten letter, and attached an old drawing by Noah, already a bit faded, pasted onto a blue poster board. At the end of the letter, Claire wrote, "You saved me before you even knew it. I only returned what you had already given me, a place in the world." Henry smiled, holding the paper delicately. He sat down, again rested his head, and closed his eyes. The world hadn't changed that much. The streets remained cold in the winter, the buses were still late, and many people continued to be invisible. But he knew, with all the certainties time had given him, that small gestures could still be the greatest revolutions, and that sometimes all someone needs to change a life is one simple act, done by someone who still believes. A few months later, Claire organized a discreet ceremony to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the Refuge 302 project. Nothing grandiose, just friends, close collaborators, a few families benefited by Infinity's initiatives, and a children's choir singing soft songs in an auditorium lit with warm yellow light. At the end of the event, Henry was called to the stage. He didn't like microphones, much less being the center of attention, but he went up. He took a deep breath. He looked at Noah, who waved from the audience with a proud smile, and then at Claire, who crossed her arms as if she knew he didn't need to say much to be immense. Henry then took the microphone, adjusted his glasses, and said, "I'm only here because someone, one day, saw me in the cold and didn't give up. No matter who you are, what you have, or how many times you've fallen, if you can help someone, even with little, do it. Because you never know the magnitude of the good that can come from it. Sometimes it changes everything. It changed for me." And he left the stage without rehearsed applause, without flashing lights, but with nearly everyone's eyes brimming with tears. That night, back home, Henry entered Noah's already sleeping room, covered the boy, and stayed for a while watching. Then he walked to the closet and opened the drawer where the old coat now lay folded. Not framed or on display, just there nearby, a silent reminder of the day when, broken inside and freezing outside, he chose to give the little he had. And in return, he received everything he needed: love, dignity, a new beginning. He closed the drawer carefully, turned off the lights in the house, and went to sleep with a peaceful heart. For the first time in many years, there was no just for now. It was now. It was here, and it was enough. If this story moved you, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.